Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are sitting on today at various locations, and in particular, the Darug people of the Darug Nation, where this institute is located on our Parramatta South campus, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome back to our Chinese Australian History Seminar Series. Before we start the session, I'd like to remind everyone that we have the recordings of all previous sessions posted on our website. And I'm pleased to report that there are many listeners who have accessed the recordings. And today we are having lecture 5, the second last one of this series, and we will continue to series 2 in 2021. In this lecture, Professor Michael Williams will cover the period from 1936 to 1972, a very interesting period both in and outside Australia. As before, we will have a Q&A session after the lecture, so please post your questions in Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Michael to answer when he finishes the lecture. Now, please welcome Professor Michael Williams.
Okay, thank you, Jen, for that generous introduction, as usual. Very well said. And today, as Jen said, we'll be talking about a period full of wars and revolutions. I'll just set my screen up here. Wars and revolutions, so 1936 to 1972. But before I get into that period, I just want to mention something that I began with at the beginning of this series, that is, say, the idea of mirroring. The first session of this series was called Mirroring Chinese Australian History, in which I emphasise a comparison between the pre-1949 history with the post-1989 history. Now, because this period, 1936-1972, is of course well before 1989, but I just want to kind of emphasise the idea that this is when the mirroring begins to reflect back a little bit. By mirroring, I mean that certain things are the same, certain things are different, as if looking in a mirror in reverse, particularly in terms of class, language, gender, identity, and even aspects of multiculturalism. So a lot of these things are much stronger in the post-1989 period. These dates, such as 1989 or 1949 or 1972, dates are arbitrary. They're just conveniences. They're not actual turning points. And things begin, of course, always before they become more obvious. So this is a period when these changes begin, very slowly, very intermittently, but inexorably, these are the changes that begin, and the origin can be seen very much in this period of great transition and change as we go through wars and revolutions. So I'll just give you a bit of a rundown of what I'm going to be talking about today. We begin with the anti-Japanese war, which of course begins more with aggressions in China before it begins to directly affect Australia, but Australia begins to fear this, and so this impacts upon Chinese in Australia, Chinese Australians, as well as the broader Australian community. The war in the Pacific has its major impact in a great many ways, particularly allowing large numbers of refugees to enter Australia, many of Chinese origin, and this has a profound impact on a Chinese Australian community that had been greatly affected by the White Australia policy. Then after the war, we have a period where people attempt to turn the clock back, as it were, to make things as if the war had never happened. And this again has an impact, and this is particularly undertaken by Arthur Corwell as he attempts to make refugees and others leave Australia. But the world's changed, and it's no longer possible to do that. And instead, the new government, the new Liberal government in the post-1949 period, instead kind of tries to adapt to these changes. And this, at first, is about bringing immigration, large-scale immigration, but it's very much a white immigration. This is Harold Holt, the immigration minister in the early Menzies government of the 1950s. And you can see the emphasis then on white and, if possible, cute migration and not migration from Asia. But nevertheless, the world has changed. And so the White Australia policy has to gradually develop a kind of a rearguard action in this period. And things change. Citizenship for people of Chinese origin for the first time. And more people coming to Australia to study, this time to study at universities. And this has an impact. And of course, we're used to the idea of student immigrants today, but it begins very much in the 1950s and 1960s. And finally, the period that we're ending with when Australia blatantly recognises the government of China that had been in power since 1949. And this, of course, also has profound impact upon the Chinese Australian community and sets the scene for much greater changes in the period thereafter. So, to begin, we're talking about the period of 1936 to about 1941, which is a period where Japanese aggression is greatly impacting upon China, but before it directly impacts upon Australia. And so this period, this mid-1930s, this is where we ended the previous lecture. And so I just want to say that in a sense, the mid-1930s is a high point in two regards. It's a high point of the White Australia policy, and it's the high point of the Republic of China. High point is of course, something that you can see in retrospect. History allows us to see this. So at the time, of course, people thought the White Australia policy was well entrenched and wasn't going anywhere. But in hindsight, we can see that that was probably the period point at which the number of non-white people within Australia or Australia's whiteness reached its statistical peak. And after this period, it gradually begins decline and increasingly change. And similarly, the Republic of China at this point seems to be at its most powerful before, of course, is impacted by a great many things from Japan, the Japanese Empire, and the Civil War and the rebellion from the Communist Party. I just want to mention something within Chinese history at this point, the so-called, this famous Xi'an incident, which people, students of Chinese history will know very well. It's the point at which the leader of China, the Republic of China at the time, Chiang Kai-shek, is forced to compromise and to make an alliance with the Communist Party in order to present a united front with Japan. Now, it's a famous incident, and I won't go into details about it if you don't already know about it, but I just want to emphasize that an Australian was strongly involved in that particular incident. This is William Donald, who was an advisor, a journalist and advisor of Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Sung Mei-lin. And during this Xi'an incident, when Chiang Kai-shek's life seemed to be in danger, when he'd actually been kidnapped by some of his allies, his wife sent William Donald to negotiate, and he was heavily involved in this. And often this is just a footnote of history, isn't always mentioned too much, particularly by Chinese historians. And I emphasize this not to try and emphasize the Australian involvement, but in fact the opposite, to say that it really didn't matter whether William Donald was an Australian or not. He was just a figure that was involved within the inner circle. He could have been American, he could have been any other nationality, because Australia at this time has minimal or no impact upon China and very little relationships with China. And this continues for quite a while, even as Australia normally becomes an ally of China in the war against Japan. So these high points, the White Australia policy and the Republic of China, their declines are, if not triggered, at least hastened by the aggressions of the Japanese Empire. It's worth remembering that, of course, China and Japan are at war long before the nominal beginning of World War II in August of 1939. And of course, there's much fighting going on before the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong in December of 1941, which has a great impact upon people in Australia. And of course, it's the same time as the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brings the United States into the war as well. So what does all this mean for Chinese Australian history? So one thing is that it's a period when Chinese Australians increasingly identify themselves as Chinese in a very strong race nationalist sense. And this, of course, is partly a reaction against the Japanese Empire, which is also carrying out a very strong race nationalism at this point. I mean, the Japanese ethos at this time is that the Japanese race is superior to other races, and this is meant to be a justification of some of their actions within Asia and elsewhere. And their hatred or attacks on Chinese are partly with an ideology that the Chinese are in themselves an inferior race, which of course is something the Chinese react against. And so people in Australia are wanting to help China at this time and are beginning to identify more in a much stronger way than they had done perhaps previously. It's also a period when non-Chinese Australians become much more aware both of the Japanese threat, but also they begin to become aware of China and the Chinese as not just market gardeners or a threat to white Australia. And so there's some sympathy for Chinese as people begins to grow. And this, of course, is going to have a profound impact upon the psychology that is the basis of the White Australia policy. You can't continue to have this kind of race-based ideology if you have a sympathy for people and begin to realise that people suffer in an equal way under these kinds of circumstances. So this is a generalised change that can be identified in this period. As you can see, these atrocities take place, cause much fear and sympathy, and some of this sympathy leads to defiance of the government. So the government at this time, a very conservative government, is trying an appeasement line. It's trying to keep a low profile. It's trying to hope that the Japanese Empire won't notice Australia exists if it doesn't do anything to antagonise them. But people, particularly unionists, people of working class, realise that there's more to fear, and they begin to sympathise, particularly with a series of incidents to do with ships. So the Silksworth, for example, in October 1937, is an incident where Chinese seamen, and most of these ships were crewed by Chinese people. Chinese seamen had to left the ship in fear of their lives. They didn't want to return on that boat because they thought that they would be in danger, and they were looked after and sympathised with by trade unionists, particularly in Newcastle. Similarly with the Darfram, this was a ship that the wharf labourers in Wollongong refused to load because it was being loaded with pig iron. And this is when Robert Menzies gets his nickname of Pig Iron Bob. He was not the Prime Minister at this time, of course, but the Attorney General, and he led the resistance to the wharf labourers and the effort to try and enforce the government's policy at this time, and found himself caused a great deal of unpopularity at this time. But at the same time, the Chinese community, of course, supported the workers. They donated to the striking workers, the wharf labourers and so forth, and the trade unions began to form, or the Trades and Labour Councils began to form organisations such as the Hands Off China campaign, so designed to both pressure the government into changing its policy and to resist the Japanese Empire. And at the same time, the Chinese community in Australia began a series of fundraising events, and of course this was then a chance for the reappearance of Chinese opera in Australia. As I looked at previous episodes in this series, I talked about Chinese opera being quite common in Australia in the late 19th up until the early 20th century, when it died out. Now it revives again in this period as a kind of fundraising exercise, and quite a number of operas and other entertainments are put on in order to raise funds to donate back to China. And much of this is done among the Chinese community, but also in close alliance with the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, which is the ruling party of China at this time, but also has strong networks within Australia, including, you can see here, the Nationalist Party building in Sydney's Haymarket, and there's a similar building down in Melbourne. Built in 1921, as that says, but of course very strong within the community and helping to organise events and lobbying of the governments. So this confused political and social situation, of course, begins to change in 1941 when the Japanese aggression takes on a new phase as they attack Pearl Harbor and invade Hong Kong and then sweep down through Southeast Asia and appear to be even heading towards Australia itself. Now, this causes a number of things to happen, one of which is a flood of refugees come into Australia. So the islands of the Pacific are being invaded by the Japanese, which means people have to be evacuated. And this includes the Chinese populations of these islands, who are, of course, under direct threat if they were to be come under Japanese occupation. So the Australian government does agree, fairly reluctantly, but nevertheless does agree to take the people as refugees. And it definitely sees this as a breach of the White Australia policy. And so it continues to resist, it continues to emphasise that these people coming into Australia are very much temporary and they will have to go back once the war is over. Now this resistance, or rather this defence of the White Australia policy, even goes so far as to greatly affect Australia's relationships with China. And this is illustrated, interestingly, in this particular film. This is part of a series of films that was made by the Americans as a propaganda effort to explain to people what the war was, why the war was taking place. This is called the Battle of China. And at the end of the version that appears, that you can see on YouTube, there's a little addition to the end of this film put on by the Australians. And basically, it's rather plaintively says, we asked of no nation other than to be left alone to live our own lives in our own way. And this is very much a part of the mentality of Australia at the time, to be left alone. That the great fear of the Japanese is that we might have to change things such as the White Australia policy. And this means that they refused to sign a treaty. Australian government refused to sign a treaty with China. The American government signs a treaty with China and as a result begins to dismantle some of its anti-Chinese immigration legislation. Australia refuses to, or stalls on signing a treaty anyway, very much on the grounds that if they had signed a treaty with China, then China would be within its rights to demand that the White Australia policy be modified. And they weren't willing to do that. The other aspect of this war situation, insofar as the Chinese Australian community is concerned, is that numbers of people, not just refugees from the islands, but also people begin to come into Australia from Shanghai and Hong Kong who were Australians. As I say, Australian born, who had the right to enter Australia, and they'd previously been living in places such as Hong Kong and Shanghai, and now, of course, were under threat or wanted to escape the Japanese occupation, and they also come back to Australia to enlarge this Chinese Australian community. So, as a result, some 15,000 people arrived in Australia as refugees. Not all Chinese by any means, but certainly a large proportion of them are shopkeepers from the islands, Chinese seamen, and others. And so this, because a large proportion of them are seamen, they organised themselves into the Chinese Seamen's Union in January of 1942. This is one of their organisational committee in the, if you recognise this, this is in the lobby of the Trades and Labour Council in the Haymarket in Sydney. And so these Seamen's Union, of course, helped to protect these workers, protect them as they are sent around Australia to do various kinds of work, to work for the war efforts. They're organised in the labour corps. Some of them work on Warragamba Dam. Some of them are sent ultimately to work to help the Americans to build, prepare for the invasion of the Philippines, or re-invasion of the Philippines, based on Brisbane, where the American command was based. So all this has an impact by spreading Chinese people right around Australia and making them work and deal with Australia on various forms of equality and unionism and so forth. Another side issue to this is that Darwin, the Darwin Chinatown, is destroyed. So Darwin had a very strong Chinese population. It was, of course, bombed by the Japanese during the war and had to be evacuated. And of course, this damaged the town. But as we now know, and well documented, what also happened was that the Australian troops rioted at one point and burnt down or destroyed much of the Darwin Chinatown. And this is seen as a bit of complicity there, in the sense that not just destruction of property that was never accounted for, but was basically the idea that, oh, well, Darwin would be better off if we didn't have this kind of Chinatown. Of course, it didn't work out that way. Chinese people returned, of course, to their homes and rebuilt some of the Chinatown, but it was never the same as it was before the war. Now, another thing that happened was that many organisations began to be formed to help to work for the war effort, China-Australia associations, this time not limited only to Chinese Australians, but also to the members of the wider community. And these people, again, were sympathetic to China, sympathetic to Chinese Australians, and they began to challenge, even as the war was going on, the White Australia policy. They did the logical thing to say, well, if China and Chinese people are allies, why do we have a White Australia policy? What is the justification for this? This is just one example of these pamphlets, and this gradual lobbying against the White Australia policy also begins in this period and, of course, takes on more emphasis in the 1950s. An interesting thing about this particular pamphlet is it's written by G.H. Burchett, who was the father of William Burchett, who later became well known, or even notorious in the Cold War period, as a journalist who wrote on behalf of or supported, or at least was trying to be objective about the Vietnam War, and even resided in North Vietnam for a period of time to report on the Vietnamese side of the war. Now, with the end of the war, in 1945 to about 1949, Australia, and again, the Australian government did what many countries, or colonial countries did, such as the French and the Dutch, and they attempted to turn back the clock. They attempted to say, all right, the Japanese invasion, the Japanese Empire was just a temporary blip on our colonial life, and we're going to make everything back again as it was. And from an Australian point of view, this was an effort to make sure all the refugees left Australia, that the White Australia policy would not be infringed upon by these refugees. Now, what happened was that there was a great deal of public sympathy to many people, and there was also a famous High Court case which involved this woman, Annie O'Keefe, not Chinese but Indonesian, who'd married a Dutch man, and her family had been refugees in Australia. Her husband had died during the war as part of his war efforts. Arthur Cole and the Immigration Department had attempted to expel her along with other refugees to make her return. They challenged it, and she won her High Court case and was able to stay. Now, the result of that was that the legal basis upon which the government could force people to remove was damaged or greatly changed. And so Arthur Cole tried to bring in a new act, the Wartime Refugees Removal Act, in order to give him the power again to remove people. Now, this, of course, caused a lot of public sympathy, a lot of argument against the government, and eventually a lot of Chinese community support for these measures to resist this. Of course, many people did go back, or many people wanted to go back. Many people returned to their home villages for their own purposes. But the world was changing, and it was no longer possible to simply pretend that the war hadn't happened, or that there weren't refugees in Australia, people who come as refugees who had settled, married, made relationships, or who simply wanted to stay in Australia. So before I move on to the post-colonial world, I'll just tell you a little bit about this particular group of refugees, just to give you an idea of what was happening to them, because again, we forget about what the human side of these workers. So 500 of the refugees were actually workers from Nauru. They'd been working there on the phosphate mines, and they were evacuated to Australia, mostly from Taishan or from Hong Kong, and they were sent to various places around Australia to work, again on wolfram mines in the middle of Australia and other places. And they were known and highlighted at the time. It's interesting to note that people knew perfectly well this was happening. And often when journalists and others rediscover this story, they'll talk about it as being a hidden history, which is always a bit of a misnomer. The histories are never hidden. What happens is that people usually know what was happening at the time they were living, but historians and others who write often forget about these things. They don't do their research well enough. And so things get neglected and have to be rediscovered again and again. So it's not so much hidden as simply forgotten, but very often there's certainly plenty of evidence of what was happening. And so these Chinese workers were working all around Australia. They did quite a lot of things. They negotiated for their contracts. They made sure that their remittances that were sent back home were free of charge. They had their own theatre. They grew their own vegetables. They had a big dispute at one stage about income tax. They didn't want to have to pay income tax to the Australian government. In the end, they were moved to Queensland, where they worked for the United States Army. And then at the end of the war, most returned home. We don't entirely know whether they returned voluntarily or under pressure from the government, but they did. But we do know that by 1956, some 76 of these men were still living in Australia. We know this because they were still arguing for compensation from the mine owners in Nauru for their lost property as a result of the evacuation. So that's just a bit of a kind of a mini picture of some of the refugee groups that had come to Australia during the war as a result of the Japanese invasion. But in the post-colonial world, what happened was that, of course, in 1949, governments changed. The government of China changes, but so does the government in Australia. The Labor government falls, and the Liberal Party, which is now the new Liberal Party, the new conservative force in Australia, has taken advantage of the Labor government's embarrassment about the refugee problem and made all kinds of noises about how it wasn't going to be so mean to refugees. But that wasn't to mean that they weren't going to be as equally committed to the White Australia policy. And so they get into power in 1949, and they don't enforce the Refugee Removals Act, and they do allow more people to stay. But it's really just a matter of trying to kind of calm down the waters so they can continue the White Australia policy unhindered. But because of the changing world, the post-colonial world, this effort to try and maintain the White Australia policy gradually turns into a bit of a rearguard action. Very reluctantly try to maintain the White Australia policy. What happens is that the legal mechanism for this that has lasted for so long, the certificate of exemption system pretty well breaks down. The certificate of exemptions legally don't seem to have any force whatsoever. And the bureaucracy admits this to themselves, admits this, but doesn't try to tell anybody, tries not to tell anybody, tries to make sure that people on these certificate of exemption are kind of kept hanging around, not really sure whether they can stay in Australia or not for as long as possible. So the Chinese community, those newer arrivals that came during the war, are going through a very unsettled period. But at the same time, they are being able to kind of work more openly in the community, get jobs wherever they want. I mean, there's a big high labour demand, and so it's much easier for people to work, and they're no longer so restricted to just working for Chinese-related businesses as they had been in the previous period. And the other change is that more and more people are coming into Australia that are not just Cantonese speakers from southern China, more Mandarin speakers, more refugees from the nationalist government, so people who are related to the Kuomintang, and just a wider spread of people speaking other dialects as well as Mandarin. Now, the other thing that's happening, of course, is that you've got increased nationalism in the so-called Third World. The Bandung Conference here in the mid-1950s, with China attempting to lead the Third World, puts a lot of fear into Australia. Australia, during the Cold War, very allied with the United States, can't distinguish between nationalism and communism, and sees a threat from any kind of government that wants to try and be more independent and not necessarily follow a world led by a so-called leader of the free world at this time, the United States. And so this leads to a lot of difficulties in the relationships that Australia has with its now newly independent nations around Southeast Asia. So it's in this post-colonial period that the government kind of gradually becomes aware that it's actually the Australian government or Australian people gradually become more aware that they're now living within an Asian sphere of the world. In some ways, they're able to maintain their isolationist or white Australia policy attitude because the People's Republic of China can now be seen as not the wartime ally that they had. So while they might have been forced to be sympathetic towards the Republican of China government, the new government in China can be seen as being a new government, completely nothing to do with them. And so they don't feel any shame about maintaining a white Australia policy in this area. In fact, anti-communism tends to reinforce what can be seen to be a decaying anti-Chinese racism. Sympathy with China, sympathy with refugees, sympathy with hostility or reaction against the kind of extreme racism that the Japanese Empire and the Nazis also represented, all means that racism itself is becoming a dying or at least a lessening force. But as far as Chinese are concerned, there's a possibility of saying, oh, well, Chinese are all communists anyway, and we're all against communism. So there's still a kind of a barrier and hostility that governments are able to take a hold of. But in this case, what's happening is it's not so much what's happening in China, but it's what's happening among Chinese people within other parts of the world. So there's a remigration now of the Chinese diaspora. And many people of Chinese origin begin to seek to come to Australia from places such as Malaysia or Hong Kong or Singapore. Some 30,000 people of Chinese origin come to Australia in the 50s and 60s. And this, of course, is in comparison to 1 million or so people coming from Europe. So it's quite small numbers, but given the Australian attitude at this time towards whiteness, or towards Europeanness at least, even 30,000 is considered to be a dangerous number, and the government is constantly being cautious about how many people is allowed to come to Australia. So in terms of the old Chinese Australian community, the new government in China also means reduced family contacts. The attitudes towards people outside China, attitudes towards remittances, attitudes towards people with money or land mean that these families suffer quite a lot in southern China, and many people don't go back or are cut off from their families or are reluctant to maintain connections. Not all, I mean, some people do go back. There is some connections. The border between Hong Kong and China is never completely closed, and people go back and forth quite a lot. And some return to China for political reasons. They feel they want to support the government of China. And so many Chinese Australians do go back to China to help that government. And they have relationships of varying negative and positive results due to, of course, the political changes that are happening in China at this time. Now, the other major thing that happens is, of course, there are many, many people, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people leave southern China and enter Hong Kong in order to escape both the political changes and some of the economic collapse that's happening in China at this time. So Hong Kong is under great pressure. And as it had during the war, the British government appealed to the Australian government to take some of these people. And the Australian government refused. It refused to look upon people in Hong Kong as refugees and as anyone they had to take for that as a result of their refugee status as such. They're taking plenty of people from Europe on the grounds of their refugee status, but not from Hong Kong. So instead, we have a rather strange kind of evolution of the older style substitute and assistance scheme under the evolution of the Australian Chinese restaurant. So if you remember, in the 1920s and 30s, many people could work on market gardens and bring in people on certificates of exemption to take their place in a market garden or in a shop or whatever, as long as it was perceived as being some kind of Chinese employment. So similarly, the Chinese restaurants, Australian Chinese restaurants, were perceived as being a legitimate Chinese trade, and people could bring in people to work as waiters or cooks within these restaurants. And so this meant that people could start opening restaurants. So a lot more Chinese Australian restaurants were opened all around rural Australia in order to allow people to bring in people from Hong Kong. So you had a kind of de facto refugee policy whereby people were coming in, usually relatives, of course, of the people who established these restaurants, in order to give them jobs and give them an in into Australia. In Australia, the Australian bureaucracy recognised this, and they would do tours around these cafes and they would assess them to see how legitimate they were within the bureaucratic standard of a Chinese chef and assistants for their certificate of exemption. So they would inspect the size of the cafe, what kind of food was being served, what percentage of it was prepared in a Chinese fashion, and various other things such as the turnover of the business and so forth. And on this basis, they would accept or decline any applications on the part of these restaurant owners to bring in new staff or effectively to bring in people from Hong Kong into Australia. So this connection between southern China, Hong Kong and Australia is a continuity, of course, of the history that was there before, but changing and evolving to meet the circumstances of both Australia and China. At the same time, the number of older domiciles, that is to say the people who had been living in Australia before 1901, the ones who had been working on the market gardens, they were declining and getting old, and they were not being replaced because the newer arrivals from Italy and other places were taking over the market gardens. So the market gardens were no longer seen as being exclusively Chinese. It was a gradual changeover into who was running these and supplying the vegetables of Australia. At the same time, you can see this is a beginning of a kind of a proto-multiculturalism when there's still very, very assimilationist Australia. The arrival of so many people from Europe with different fashions, different tastes, was gradually affecting Australian tastes. And so spaghetti bolognese became an exotic meal in the 1950s, and people accepted Chinese Australian meals at the same time. I mean, they weren't very Chinese, but they were Chinese enough, obviously, to satisfy the bureaucracy, but they also had to cater to the tastes of Australians, particularly in the countryside. So all this meant a gradual, slow death of the White Australia policy. You can see this period, 50s and into the 60s, as a kind of like the period of the White Australia policy survivors. So it survived within this assimilationist group, and so many things are beginning to change. One significant thing is that for the first time since late 19th century, people of Chinese origin, people of Chinese birth could become naturalized. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But at the same time, China is being perceived as Red China, and organizations such as the Chinese Youth League are being seen as being Communist Front organizations, are being spied upon. ASIO, which at the time used a telegraph designation that was very James Bondian, I thought, Scorpion, pretty much regarded all Chinese as potential communists. And this made it very difficult for people to become naturalized. So much so, in fact, that the Immigration Department pretty much began to ignore ASIO briefings. ASIO tended to try and bar anyone of Chinese origin who wanted to be naturalized so regularly and that the immigration department decided they just weren't worth the paper they were written on and just began to pass people to be naturalised anyway. Because people in the community didn't know that, and they still very much feared these ASIO intrusions, but certainly the immigration department didn't seem to give it much credence. Now, another, just an interesting example of the kind of atmosphere of this Cold War atmosphere is opera again appears in the history. This time, not a community-based opera, but an opera actually sent by the government of China, a northern opera, a Beijing opera rather than a Cantonese opera, kind of soft politics. And the government, in fact, bans this opera. It's due to come to Australia at the same time as the Melbourne Olympics, 1956. And so the Menzies government bans it, or rather tells it at least that it can't come to Australia until after the Olympics. And the Menzies government gets quite a lot of flack for this and is accused of being Philistines and not appreciating culture and so forth and so forth. The Tribune, which of course was the mouthpiece of the Communist Party at the time, recognised, in fact, that it was the United States was behind this opera ban. The mainstream newspapers at the time didn't mention that, but when you look at the files that are now released, you can see that quite clearly it was the United States. The United States was very adamant that this opera should not come to Australia, that this would be too much of a propaganda coup as far as they were concerned. And they actually threatened that their servicemen would go on a rampage around Melbourne at the time of the Olympics if the opera turned up there. This, of course, scared the Melbourne Olympic Committee, and they put great pressure on the Menzies government, and Menzies reluctantly, rather reluctantly, in fact, put off the opera and told them they couldn't come, and took the flak for this decision. He didn't blame the United States as such. He was too loyal an ally to do that. So this is the kind of atmosphere in which people are operating. And at the same time, there's other changes, of course. So urbanisation is ongoing. The rural communities of Chinese Australians were gradually deciding to move into the cities. So many of the old stores that they'd run for many years, since the late 19th century, family stores in various towns, they gradually sold them up, or a new generation decided not to continue on, and they moved into the cities and went from running market gardens to running fruit shops and vegetable shops, among other things. And of course, those that were Australian born were becoming a little more assimilated as much as they could within a still very racist white Australia. But if they were relating to China, they were relating more and more now to their relatives in Hong Kong, less and less directly to the villagers in China. Now, the other thing that I mentioned was the students beginning to come to Australia. Now, the Australian government, as part of its kind of anti-communist policy within Southeast Asia, joined the Colombo Plan. And the Colombo Plan was designed to help and support governments to make them wealthier, and so therefore more resistant to any kind of communist takeover, was the theory. And part of this was the Colombo Plan, which was designed to allow students to come to Australia from various countries around Southeast Asia to work, to study, and then when they'd finished studying, they were required to return. Now, this, of course, was a breach of the White Australia policy as far as some people were concerned. And the government was very keen to show these students as very clean-cut, no threat at all, very nice young people, very intelligent. And this had its propaganda impact. It did show people that, of course, people of Asian origin, people of Chinese origin, could be clean-cut and educated and so forth. And this was, of course, going against these previous stereotypes of market gardeners and people who were living in huts in gold mines and so forth. But this is a bit of a con job on the part of the government as well, because the reality was that for every 1 or 2 Colombo Plan students, there was 8 or 9 students coming who were self-funded. Now, these self-funded students coming from Malaysia and Hong Kong and other places were not required to return home at all. They could come to Australia, they could study at university, and if they could get a job afterwards, they could stay. Very similar to many of the students today. But the government didn't like to emphasise that too much, because this was, of course, a gradual widening of immigration policy in a way that they were very afraid would lead to a backlash if the wider population knew more about this. So they emphasised the Colombo Plan, which in theory meant that people were returning. But at the same time, it did give people an idea that people of all backgrounds could be seen to be educated and not a threat to Australian civilisation as perceived by the white Australian faddists. Now, the other remarkable thing that happened in this period is in 1958, the dictation test was finally abolished. But it wasn't abolished in order to lessen or weaken the White Australia policy. In fact, the opposite. It was abolished in order to, because it became distasteful. It became a target for those that hated the White Australia policy. They became a bit of a joke. Finally, after all these years, this fake dictation test. And so basically it was abolished so that things would change, so that they would remain the same. So it's very much part of the government trying to kind of smooth things out again and maintain the policy relatively unchanged if it could. But what it also did was begin to adopt what they officially called a liberal attitude. They thought they were being very liberal anyway. And this was a slow erosion of the system, which included citizenship. So again, for the first time, people of Chinese origin or Asian origin could become citizens. They had to have lived in Australia for 15 years, 5 for Europeans at first, a little later changed to the same 5 years in the 60s. And this is all part of Australia struggling to come to terms with its existence, its position within Asia. And there was more and more open lobbying against the White Australia policy, including because many people were saying Australia should adopt a quota system similar to that existed in the in the United States. Another change, this didn't happen, of course, but the government was quite reluctant to make such an obvious change. Other changes included increased intermarriage, and this was partly because the laws changed so that women no longer lost their citizenship when they married a person of another citizenship. This had been the case for many years. This now changed, so intermarriage now became something that could in fact be an advantage for someone marrying an Australian citizen. As I said, I mentioned the students. This is a shift from people of Asian origin, non-white origin, being more middle class. And by and large, this period of the 50s and 60s is one I'd have to say that we don't know a lot about in great detail, because the historians of Chinese Australia have tended to focus on the pre-49 period, going back to the 19th century, early 20th century, done their archival research and so forth, but they haven't done a lot of research, nowhere near enough, of the 50s and 60s, a very important period, still a living memory. And so I'd have to say that this history is not as detailed as I'd like it to be, but we certainly can improve upon that. And of course, the other final major change, quite significant, was, before I figured that, that's right, I was just going to mention this was the cabinet minutes about citizenship. And I was going to emphasize that they were arguing that people should have an adequate knowledge of English and they should take a normal part in Australian life. And the Immigration Department at that time they weren't really told what that meant, what it was normal Australian life. And so when they began to investigate Chinese people applying for naturalisation, they literally asked, did they drink beer and did they go to barbecues with their Australian, so their white neighbours? So the idea of what constitutes Australianness was, as bureaucrats often manage to do, relatively superficial. And this literally became part of the criteria by which people were granted naturalisation. Nevertheless, a significant change and one that gave people a much more stake within the Australian community. And the other major change was the Labor Party officially changed its policy. So it always had an official plank on supporting the White Australia policy. And finally, in 1965, with Gough Whitlam as deputy leader and Arthur Calwell resisting, but finally agreeing, they decided to abolish the White Australia policy from their plank and have a much more equal immigration program. Of course, this meant nothing in 1965 with the Labor Party still in opposition, but they were a potential government and they showed that they were prepared to do much more than the Liberal Party was with its piecemeal changes. So I've said so that there's a bit of a gap in the history. So we need to understand that this is, of course, a history of people, families. This is what I'm giving here is a bit of an overview, and we shouldn't be forgetting the kind of human basis of all this. These are people and families. Some 26,000 people are coming into Australia of Chinese origin, Chinese heritage in this period in the 60s. Half of them are students, so relatively young, who will marry and whose children will be born in Australia. And what we've got, of course, as representative of the Chinese community of this time, the Dixon Street cafes, which were quite popular, a bit more down market than they were, often run by people coming from Hong Kong. In fact, it was kind of well known that the latest fashions in food from Hong Kong would arrive in these Australian restaurants when they got a new cook, a new chef came in. We had people like, say, King Fong, whose family came from via Fiji and decided to stay in Australia, even though originally they were on their way back to China. King Fong grew up right as a young man, but grew up in Chinatown, Dixon Street, ran a store, took over his father's store, and became quite well known. You can see how things changed. If you look on the left there, the DDT that he's selling in this store, obviously reminiscent of a time when market gardening was important and when people actually sprayed this stuff on the crops. We had people like, say, Arthur Chang, who was involved with the Chinese Youth League, was spied upon by ASIO, and eventually was awarded Australian honours. People like Irene Moss, Irene Nee Kwok, who grew up in Chinatown and tell stories of chasing pigeons to sell to the restaurants in the Chinatown restaurants and this kind of thing. So these are all, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people like this whose stories, some are well known and some are not, could be told with further research there in this very changing, transforming period of Chinese Australian history. The other thing, as I've said, is that the rural base and rural communities are declining as men aged and weren't replaced, either returned to China or moved into the cities. So, for example, the Chinese Masonic societies disappear. There were Masonic societies scattered around most parts of Australia, and these gradually disappear, have no more members. There's a plundering of temples. For example, there's no one left to look after them. The temple at Tingha collapses with no one left to look after it. It eventually finds its way under a shed somewhere where someone finds them, and later on they're all transferred to a museum in Uralla. In Tasmania, there's many temples there, part of the tin mining communities. They decline, but fortunately there's a small community in Launceston, and Chinese community, and they salvage those temple remains and put them in a museum in Launceston where they are preserved till today. So there's various things happening with the heritage over this period. For example, in 1961, the Ballarat Joss House is destroyed, having survived for so many years since the gold rush period. It's not destroyed with any intention to wipe out Chinese heritage. It's destroyed along with so much of the heritage at that time because people just thought of these things as old buildings that needed to be cleared away. And so a lot of this is lost. Of all the hundreds of temples that there were around Australia, there's only a handful left today. So finally, we come to the period where China is beginning to be recognised as existing, and China itself comes much more into the equation again. This recognition in 1972 of the People's Republic of China is, of course, greatly welcomed by the Chinese Australian community, but it's welcome regardless of political leanings. And it's not welcome because they're all communists by any means. They're welcome because it means they can reconnect with China, reconnect with their cultural origins, and perhaps influence and change a China that they see has gone through many traumas in the period since 1949 or before. Now, Australia's policy, of course, in not recognising the Chinese government at this time was very much mixed with its role in Vietnam and its alliance with the United States. But that period of time when nominally Chinese troops and Australian troops were fighting on opposite sides, although they were declaring war against each other, was nevertheless a time when the Australian government, in fact, sold quite a lot, did a lot of trade with China. It sold some millions of dollars of a year of wheat, which dropped dramatically to zero in 1970. And it did this because the Chinese government decided it was going to buy its wheat from Canada, which did recognise the government. And the Australian government, even after that, a bit of a wake-up call, and even with the United States gradually easing some restrictions, was at that point incapable of responding to these changes. Instead, it was left to the opposition, now led by Gough Whitlam, who, while still in opposition, sent a telegram to Zhou Enlai asking to discuss the terms on which your country is interested in having diplomatic and trade relations with Australia. And so as a result of that, a rather dramatic trip took place. Gough Whitlam visiting China and even meeting with Zhou Enlai, of course, and also meeting with Mao. And then it meant that he was then in a position when they finally got in the government at the end of 1972 to immediately recognise the Chinese government. Now that brings us to nearly to the end of our period. And I just, as usual, I'll give you some suggested readings, but I just want you to note the last 3 readings in this list here are all personal memoirs. Stanley Hunt, Francis Lee, and Andrew Guong are all people who grew up in Australia, but had memories of China and of their connections with China and of their life in Australia. And so this is the beginnings. I can see they're all being published fairly recently. This is the beginnings of a wider knowledge of the Chinese Australian community in this period that I've been talking about. And hopefully there'll be more of these coming out. There's certainly going to be a book out, Sydney University Press next year, an oral history of a dozen or so people, which will cover this period and give you a very good insight into the thinking and the relationships that this period entailed. So just as a recap, so what does this period tell us? So it's only a short period, 1936, 1972, so a mere 36 years. So it's just a single generation, but it's one that had contained a generation of wars and revolutions, some hot, some cold, some even cultural. And as a result, there was much change. Some of it rapid, some of it gradual, some of it rapid again. And rapid, of course, as the Chinese Empire rose and fell, and rapid again as the Chinese government established itself and caused revolutionary changes within China itself. And slow, such as the Australia itself, as it gradually, agonizingly almost shed its white Australia policy. So all of these kinds of changes involve delay, attempts to turn the clock back, denial, subterfuge, and some hypocrisy. A great deal of hypocrisy going on as the government tries to deny that it has a white Australia policy at all. There never was a white Australia policy. Didn't mean anything. The kinds of things the government is saying compared to the kind of life Chinese Australians are living and trying to survive on in this period, it's quite amazing. So hypocrisy is certainly not too strong a word. So changes, mass changes. As I've said before, class, gender, language, and identity. So white Australia policy survivors are joined by a new generation of Australian-born and also by many Chinese people not born in China itself. So they bring their own identity, their own sense of Chineseness, mediated through the fact that they may not ever visited China, may not have a Chinese language themselves. Many did, of course, but others didn't. It all varied. It's a period when Chinese who drink beer at least and attend barbecues are granted citizenship and some measure of assimilation. As I say, there's some refugee arrivals, but they're usually disguised as cafe waiters or chefs. Chinese Australians themselves are increasingly recognised as Australians, begrudgingly, but more so than in the past. While Australia itself, of course, recognises China, and this, of course, has an impact which will have an even greater impact in the period we talk about at the next lecture. So this all sets the stage for further transformations in China itself as the Cultural Revolution runs its course, and in Australia as multiculturalism begins slowly, with the seeds, I think, very much embedded in this period to make that relatively revolutionary change in Australia happen the way it did. So in conclusion, I'll talk about the mirroring begins here, and I'll talk more about what that mirroring entails in the next lecture. Is class, more middle class, language diversifies away from Cantonese dialects. Gender, of course, the equality between the numbers of men and women, very much so. Identity, again, this is always a fraught topic, but certainly people identify in various ways here, in wider ways than ever before, and a kind of multiculturalism, which allows people to relax and to enjoy their own culture more. Chineseness, as I said, the diaspora Chinese bring their own ways of thinking, assimilation versus multiculturalism, identity. And then there's this increasing sense of linking Chinese with the China government, which you see happened in the Cold War, where many people who were simply being Chinese were suspected of being communist on that basis. And we see that kind of simplistic thinking is a continuity in more modern times. Whitewashing. Now, I mentioned more about whitewashing in the previous lecture. And again, we've got to look at here, for many people, looking at what was happening in the 50s and 60s as the Chinese population gradually increases. For many people, this was a new thing. Again, they failed to see the continuity of this history going back into the early 20th century, into the 19th century, because the whitewashing of Australian history doesn't make them realise just how much of continuity this Chinese Australian history is. And we've always got to be aware of that and to be aware that, yes, things are changing, but they're not new. They're evolving and changing on a basis of a past that goes back to the beginnings of European Australia. And finally, we have the sense of it, China stands up. Now, in theory, this happened in 1949, but Australia delayed the impact of that by not recognising China, and of course, China itself by having a much more internal policies for many, many years. But nevertheless, the fear and greed that Australia often evinces towards China, which did exist in the 19th century, very much was a part of the motivation for the White Australia policy, although a broader one, a few of all Asia in general, all non-white peoples. We can see this is something that begins to carry through into the present period. But the stage is set for that. In 1972, of course, this isn't obvious. In 1972, everything seems very calm when Australia recognises China, and looks like things are set to go in a much more peaceful way. But the benefit of hindsight allows us to look at these things in a different way. And so we've seen this period reflecting back on us, new elements, trade unionism, students, lobbying against the White Australia policy on a much broader front, recognition of China, and that brings us to the end of this, I think, rather interesting, if somewhat traumatic, period in Chinese Australian history. And thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Michael. This is a really interesting lecture and session. You know, as he said, it's not very long, 36 years, but it's full of things. And also, I suppose, it's more familiar to us, to listeners, you know, so sort of closer to us. So, you know, there's a lot more relevance. Before I go on to the viewers, listeners' questions, I have a question myself. So I do ask this question first while people can still thinking and writing your questions. I'm really interested and intrigued by your mirroring. So I think this mirroring is really fantastic. And now especially you emphasize at the beginning, you know, so the first lecture is actually called mirroring. And they're talking about mirroring 1950s. They're all like Chinese were regarded as communist China, communists. And the worst, obviously, fear. It's a kind of, because People's Republic of China was established, so China stood up or stand up. Do you see the mirror to today? Today, you know, like China is rising, and now ASIO has a lot of poking and Chinese Australian communities with that fear, like Chinese Australians are being seen as communist or pro-communist. Do you see there is a mirror there, or?
Yeah, well, this is what I'm hinting at. I mean, I will be talking more about that in the next lecture, which will, of course, bring us up to the contemporary period. And with things changing so much, it's making it harder and harder to write that lecture. But I just wanted to, the reason why I was talking about it now is I wanted to emphasise that, yes, it's fairly obvious you've got this, what's going to happen in contemporary times is happened before. So I just wanted to emphasise that this mirroring
it's 5 o'clock.
Is a continuation, and that while we're looking for kind of reasons why this is happening today, we need to look in the past to see why this is happening, and it's embedded in not just attitudes towards China as a politically, but to just attitudes towards China as a big nation. You know, there was fear about China going right back into the 19th century, right to the beginning and the foundation of the European Australian colonies. China was always in people's minds, both as a potential source of profit, so greed, but also as a potential danger in terms of, mostly that was seen in terms of numbers, of just simply having numbers of people coming down and swamping the white Australian population. But now I think it's seen more the similar kind of fear in terms of political power, military power, you know, as China becomes a superpower on a scale similar to the United States. And so we can see, you know, the mirroring image is meant to show that, yes, the things reflect back and look the same, but they're not the same. I mean, obviously, a mirror reflection is not a picture. It's an opposite is taking the metaphor too far, but it's different. It can be distorted, but nevertheless, it's a reflection of what happened in the past.
Yeah, so I'm sure there is a connection. So connections are quite fascinating in that sense. The content, the different affairs probably, but yeah, so it's a sort of a fundamental, basic emotions or reactions. The first question from Rich, just a comment. During the Depression of the 1930s, some Chinese Australians went to China due to lack of work in Australia. Would they stay in China? And, but the anti-Japanese were forced them back to Australia.
Well, that was a bit of a tragic period of time. I mean, many people did go back. I mean, they always went back for different reasons, but many, yes, did go back during the Depression because they lost jobs or because of the exchange rates. They could take what little capital they had and could live a bit more comfortably in China. They would go back to the villages. But with the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong, they got cut off. And so that period of time from say 1941 through 1945 was quite a terrible one for those in the villages, because two things happened. They either got cut off on the remittances that were coming from America or Australia or other places, so the money wasn't coming in. They were usually dependent upon that, or they could not leave, so they were stuck there. So people who had maybe come and only intended to stay maybe 1 or 2 years, as they often did, and then return to work again in Australia or elsewhere, found they couldn't return, so they had to stay in the villages. And so the villages of South China suffered greatly. Many people starved to death. And so when people could go again through Hong Kong back to the villages in 1945, it was quite tragic stories. People were coming back and finding the members of their family had starved to death, or that their wives had sold their children in order for them to survive. They had to give them away, and then they were desperately trying to find their children again. Terrible, terrible stories from that period in the immediate aftermath of the Japanese invasion, because the Hong Kong was so important as the gateway, and literally they were cut off during that period. The Japanese didn't occupy all of southern China, for example. They occupied about half of Zhongshan, actually, the area where a lot of people from Sydney go. And there was a market town where you could cross the border between the Japanese occupied area and the non-Japanese occupied area. That town actually did quite well, but only because it was a black market town and they were exchanging things. But so some people did well, but those that were dependent on remittances didn't do very well at all and had a lot of trouble. The Japanese forced a lot of people out of Hong Kong too. So many people took refuge in Hong Kong, and they were made to go back to the villages if they could. So that swelled the population of the villages as well, just at a time when they were had lost income and didn't have the resources to survive.
Next question is a very interesting question. Were there any generalized observation that could be made about the skill set of people from Hong Kong versus people from Taishan in the 1940s? For example, the Taishanese were more likely to be market gardeners or gold miners to be coming from Hong Kong. Are there any?
Not well. They in the 40s they were pretty well set. What they did was they just took up the jobs that were available to them. What you tend to get is people are just adaptable. I mean, when you're a poor young guy from a village in Taishan or Zhongshan or wherever, and your uncle says, "Come, I'll sponsor you to come to Sydney or to my rural town in Tinga or wherever." You just come and you do whatever work they tell you to do, and you learn it. So, I mean, the skill sets were adaptability. I think it was the most seemed to be the best one. If they were making furniture, they made furniture. If it was gardening, they were gardening. Because really, market gardening was always a key one, because that's what people would do in their retirement. I mean, and people who had spent their life as a storekeeper would retire to a village and have a garden. So market gardening or growing vegetables is just something that people of southern China love to do, and they did that in Zhongshan and Taishan. But they adapted to what was available. So people from Taishan were all laundrymen in America, because that was the thing to do. They didn't necessarily learn that until they got there, and their uncle or their father taught them to do it. In Australia, there wasn't that many laundries. Instead, they became market gardeners, or they worked in shops and so forth. So adaptation is more important than anything else. And of course, when the restaurants became more important, the cafes became more important, as I mentioned before, under the White Australia policy. Then suddenly they all became cooks. Suddenly, where I don't think they were necessarily all great cooks back in the villages, but they were able to manage to become cooks and cook quite well. Of course, sometimes they learned these skills in Hong Kong, so they were mediated through. They weren't coming directly from the villages in the 50s. They would come to Hong Kong and spend quite a few years there and learn whatever was possible there, including cooks or working. And then they would come out to Australia and bring those skills with them. So some of those skills were mediated through Hong Kong, I guess. Again, I talk about the gap in history. Some of this is just a generalized assumptions. I mean, that would be a very good, there would be a whole PhD in trying to figure out exactly what was happening and how that worked in a more systematic way.
I think you were talking about adaptation is very interesting. So not necessarily the bring skills prior to they came, and not necessarily all restaurants were run by Hong Kong people, because I think people have general assumption that all restaurants or most restaurants were run by Hong Kong people. Not necessarily, depends.
Well, in this period, it's more true than it was. Yes, it's not always, but in this period it was because they were coming through Hong Kong, and so they were Cantonese food, which is why Cantonese food is almost, for many Australians, Chinese food is simply Cantonese food. It's a later period that it begins to diversify more. And of course, there are always exceptions. Hainanese were also famous for their restaurants, and they were the seamen. Many of the sailors, the seamen had come were from Hainan, and so that Hainanese cooking was also important. But that was a particular group that came for a particular section. But yes, because of the nature of Hong Kong. But of course, not everybody in Hong Kong were Cantonese either. There were refugees coming from other parts of China as well, and they would then remigrate to Australia. So yes, it's certainly not exclusively, but still, it was Cantonese food was quite dominant.
Yeah. And Justin has a question. One topic that deserves a closer study is the increasing diversity of Chinese Australian immigration. So Shandong community goes back to 1930s. The Malaysian, Indonesian, Chinese community also grew during Colombo Plan period, and included Hokkien, Hakka, and Hong Kong Chinese still kept apart from Taoshan, where we settled in Sydney in 60s.
Yeah. So that's what I was talking about when I talked about the Chinese diaspora and so forth in the 50s and 60s. And that's where this identity thing comes in, because I mean, you've got people who identify themselves very much from their origins, whether it's from Malaysia or from their origin in Shandong or whatever. But of course, then there's this generalized sense of having Chineseness, perhaps sometimes imposed upon them by the non-Chinese population. You're Chinese whether you like it or not, and you're all the same kind of thing. So it's a very fraught business, particularly in the assimilationist era of the 50s and 60s. And again, you're quite right, your question there, that that would be a great topic to delve into much more detail about how that's done. And certainly this part of the mirroring that I was talking about happening in this period as the diversity begins, and of course that ramps up in the next period.
Did they, like Cantonese speakers and the Mandarin speakers, did they interact with each other, or did they see themselves as a part of a Chinese community, or they not necessarily see them?
Well, it was a very gradual change. I mean, at this period, even in the 50s, people from a Taishan family wouldn't like their daughters to marry someone from a Zhongshan family. So you still had differences even within the nominally Cantonese southern China areas, particularly on a family basis, depending on where they come from and so forth. And so that gradually faded away. So it's in this period that merging begins to happen, and then it was possible for Taishan families to marry Zhongshan families, or to marry a Hong Kong family, or heaven forbid, marry someone with a Mandarin background. I mean, it was still a bit of a shock in the 50s and 60s, but it varied with class and that. I mean, these students, for example, had quite different attitudes. So the students who came, they found it a bit more difficult to get on with the older Chinese communities, probably for class reasons as much as anything else. I mean, they loved going down there for the food and so forth, but they didn't necessarily socialize to any great degree. On the other hand, if they were political, then on a political basis, if you joined the Chinese Youth League or something, of course, you then felt yourself to be more Chinese in a broader way. But it's something that happened gradually, and it's something that's hard to be definitive about, because like the old antagonism between Catholics and Protestants in Australia, I mean, that was very common in the 50s and 60s. But you try and get anyone to talk about it now, and it's very, very difficult. The Australian community kind of tries to gloss over the whole Catholic Protestant hostility, and yet it was so strong that people would break up friendships over it in the 50s and 60s. Anzac Day marches were broken up by this kind of thing, and yet who mentions it now? Similar kind of thing. People kind of think, oh yeah, we were never like that. But you look at some of the old histories, you can tease out it's quite big divisions, even between on a village to village basis or dialect basis within the Chinese communities. But I hesitate to be too definitive about that. Certainly, studies need to be done or can be done on the like any group that people identify on a range of levels, and it's usually for political reasons that people try to gloss over that and pretend like, oh yeah, we never had those divisions, because you want to present a united front, but it's up to the historian to try and dig behind that and work that out. And a lot more work needs to be done, but it's certainly a fascinating area.
Since Jocelyn mentioned the Colombo plan, I have a question on that. So they were brought to Australia to study, so to have Australian Western education. Would you say that they also influence Australians' perceptions of Asian, because they all came from Asian countries?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, and the government helped that, promoted that. I mean, they used it as a propaganda tool, and so they purposely did that. And of course, there was a lot of intermarriage. I mean, obviously, young students all going to university together. This is exactly when they're going to meet people and begin to marry. So the number of intermarriages, or even if they didn't marry, at least they had boyfriends and girlfriends. They were mixing more socially, more intimately than had ever happened before. And these and across classes. So, they weren't just working class people in some shanty town. These were university students, Sydney University and other places, mixing socially. And so this, of course, had a big impact on people. If you go to university with people from another country, it influences your perception. It means you're not going to be as narrow-minded or racist about that country as, say, your parents might have been, who never went to university and who never socialised with people of another country or another culture before. So it had its impact. It was gradualist and slow. I mean, the number of people going to university, percentage of people going to universities in the 60s was nothing like it is today. So you're talking about a smaller group, but you're talking about therefore a relatively elite group, which means they're influencing the people who have become lawyers, have become engineers, a range of people who have relatively significant jobs within society. And so that's has perhaps a multiplier effect there as well. But certainly the government saw that as a something to help alleviate their fears. They were always afraid of a backlash against the White Australia policy. So they used the Colombo plan to emphasise just how non-threatening these students were. And that, of course, had its impact on how people perceived Asians. They weren't just some what they considered to be an ignorant market gardener. Here was somebody who was an engineer who spoke perfect English and who dressed in a suit and tie. And, what's the basis upon which you would be prejudiced against such a person? So yes, it had its impact, but it's gradual, and it obviously doesn't affect everybody equally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense of why students are studying. Yes, exactly. They are intellectuals, so they're different from minors. And so, yeah, that changes the perception. Yeah, very interesting. Another question from Jill. For Chinese families all over the world, language maintenance and parental involvement in education is important. What measures were in place to enable this, and what strategies did the families adopt?
Well, yeah, it changed, varied a lot. In the earlier period, they would send their children back to the villages or to Hong Kong if they could. I mean, to be raised by grandparents to go to schools to maintain the languages. So a lot of people did that. So there was a lot of going back and forth with people who were Australian born being brought up in the villages, or people coming from the villages when they were younger, and so forth. And so that was one strategy. A few people did try to establish Chinese language schools in Sydney and Melbourne, but these by and large weren't very successful. They didn't have the numbers, or people were just too busy to do that. But in the more assimilationist 50s, you found that Australian-born families who were cut off from China tended to then shift into a more assimilationist mode, or either from force of circumstances or attitudes, and they didn't try or weren't able to maintain the language as much. So more families in that period tended to lose their language, depending on their connections and so forth. It became harder, and very often people grew up without the language, and if they wanted to get it, they had to go back to Hong Kong themselves or study it at later life. And so many people, there's more people growing up of Chinese heritage who regret the fact that the life usually they would regret the fact that they weren't able to maintain their language. So it varied with your generation. So like with a lot of people, that assimilationist period, particularly the 50s and 60s, wasn't a good one. But of course, then you had new people coming in, so the language did maintain itself in the sense that people were remigrating from Hong Kong and so forth, and they of course had various languages. And of course, their English was very good too, because again, being mostly university students and so forth, they were required to develop the language or they already had it from Hong Kong anyway, develop the language to a higher skill. So you had not just people who had kept the Chinese language, but they had were equally fluent in English, including reading and writing, as opposed to, say, an older generation who may have learned English enough for functional purposes, but never were really that comfortable using it. So that was another major change as the community evolved.
Next question. Oh, it is really just a thank you, Young. It was a very interesting lecture. The next question is, do you know if the immigration Chinese would try to assimilate more by adopting a local religion, such as Anglican or Catholic religion, just to be seen as a local?
I don't think so. I mean, many of the Chinese people in Australia became Christians, but I don't think it was just to be seen to be local. I mean, right from a very early period, people converted to Christianity of various sects. And I think it was because they considered Christianity to be more modern and to be the religion of the times, that they regarded Chinese religions to be a bit superstitious. And so it was just part of their modernity, as people did in Hong Kong and other places as well. So I don't think, I mean, I obviously can't speak for everybody, but I don't get the impression that many are doing it simply for that reason. It was just natural part of the environment. I mean, typical families, maybe the father just didn't care that much about religion, and he might have kept up. I mean, even if people became Christian, that wasn't to say that they abandoned their ancestor worship things either. I mean, the style of things would stay the same. I mean, some people, of course, became more fanatically Christian, I suppose, and wanted to give up everything. But more than likely, I mean, Chinese Christianity is Chinese Christianity, and it tends to maintain elements of Chinese culture as well, which maybe are not strictly dogmatic as far as the Pope might be concerned, but by and large they adapt to their ways. But I think mostly it was just considered to be part of being modern and part of being part of the society, like learning English or something. I mean, yes, it has a functional value or it has a value, but I don't think people are doing it that consciously in any particular way. And they tended to just take up the religions that were around them, whether it was Anglican or Catholic or whatever, tended to be fairly evenly spread around.
Very good point. I suppose pretending can't last that long. It would be too long to pretend. No, it'd be too hard work. Jasmine has a question. Did the Chinese students stay, or did they usually go back? Was there a favorable immigration policy for them to stay back then?
Yes, yeah. I mean, again, similar percentages. 60% or more stay. Because in those days, I mean, someone with a university education will get a job straight away. I mean, again, university education was more elite in the 60s, so anybody who came and got a university education means that they could get a job, and if they wanted to, then they would stay. And so the self-funded people didn't have to go back. So of course, some people went back, but the figures, tend to be about 60%, which isn't much different from what it is today. Among the self-funded, the Colombo Plan ones specifically were required to go back. Some of them went back and then they could return, but mostly people who were self-funded did tend to stay, or they would go back to Hong Kong or wherever for a while, and then maybe they'd come back again. Again, once you've got an Australian university degree and sufficient English, you've always got that option to come back. And so the Australian policy was fairly open, but that's relatively speaking. That's within a framework which is very small numbers. Not at all the kind of mass immigration that we're used to now. Very small numbers from Asia compared to what was happening from Europe anyway. But given the small base, it made significant differences, significant growth to the community in that period.
My last question, small question, you mentioned that during the Japanese war against China invasion, and then in Australia, actually lots of because of the sympathy for Chinese, and hatred of Japanese soldiers and trauma or, cruelty. In those days, did you encounter any literature that they're mixing up Chinese with Japanese? Like these days, Chinese or Asians, they mix up as well.
Oh yeah, well, the Australian soldiers and the Australian public did that all the time. Yeah, there's quite a few silly stories. In fact, I can tell you a story from my own personal family. My uncle or great uncle, who was a soldier in New Guinea, was always very proud that he'd saved this guy's life. He was a sergeant, and artillery sergeant. So he had some men under him, and they were about to shoot some poor guy. And he said, stop, well, I don't think that guy's Japanese. And so they stopped and found out later on he was Chinese. So he was very proud that he saved this guy's life. So, and those kinds of stories, unfortunately, could be repeated in many places, both in the war front, but also in Australia. There's a famous letter of the Chinese consul who was living in Rose Bay, and he's feeding the pigeons down at Rose Bay. And someone wrote to say, there's a Japanese guy down there sending courier pigeons off to the Japanese fleet. I mean, that was the kind of paranoia that was gone during wartime. People were afraid, yes, they by and large would just assume everybody was Japanese because they were so fearful, unfortunately. And I dare say some Chinese people got themselves in trouble in New Guinea and other places. If they didn't meet my uncle.
I think that Jasmine has a follow-up question. What disciplines did Chinese students usually study at Australian universities? Did they mostly learn business and science and engineering as they do now? Is there any mirror up there?
Well, it wasn't business. Business studies weren't big then. Business studies became big later on. I mean, but there was engineering, science, nursing, functional, vocational things by and large. Yes, it wasn't the arts generally. Engineering was big. And if you had an engineering degree, then you get a job straight away. So yes, it was the kind of jobs that or vocational, practical kind in the sciences and in the engineering in particular, but not business. No, business wasn't run at university those days. They would laugh at you, but unfortunately, that became no business becomes the things changed, and so business is seen as a major university study nowadays. So yes. But that's something relatively relatively new. It's many years now, of course.
Well, that's just about to see this. One more question, Florence. The Australian government seemed to handle multiculturalism on a siloed basis from different countries. Was there any effort made to encourage mixing among the migrants from different countries?
In this period, there was among the European populations. I mean, they were all put in migrant camps and mixed together and this kind of thing, but and they were all put in English classes together. But with the Asian migration, since it wasn't so organised, by and large, no. The universities were a mixing element, I think, kind of de facto. But by and large, the government itself didn't do a lot. It was just left up to the people themselves how they operated. And because there were small numbers, people tended to mix a little bit, but nothing so formal as it became. I mean, with multiculturalism, when it came in, particularly as it ramped up under the Hawke Keating government, was very much a social engineering project with a great deal of government policy and a government funding behind it. That wasn't the kind of thing that happened in the 50s and 60s. I mean, the best they did then was have a migrant camp and 2 hours of English lessons a week, that kind of thing. I mean, they thought that was a big deal. Anything else was left up to church groups and local groups to invite someone around for a barbecue, make sure they drink some beer and go to a barbecue, and then they become naturalised. I mean, that kind of thing. So it was pretty basic stuff compared to what we think of as multiculturalism today.
That's really interesting. I think, Michael always gives us a very interesting lectures, and, Q&A is always very interesting as well. And, you feel like, oh, he knows so much, you can never exhaust what he knows. So it's really wonderful. And so please join me in thanking Professor Michael Williams for this wonderful session. And thank you, audience. And we're going to have the last session in early December of this series. So we will send out the notice.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.